Now, traditionally, the energy meters consisted of unidirectional meters, so they were designed to only measure the energy flowing in one way, from the grid towards you as the energy consumer. The fact that they were designed as a unidirectional meter doesn't mean that they cannot run the other way. So actually, some of the models, they will run one way when you're consuming power from the grid, and they will run backwards when you're feeding power into the grid. You're not supposed to do that, and they're not designed in that way. One of the reasons for that is that utility companies, they do not know how much power you fed back into the grid, right? You only see one number, and you see it running one way or the other way. So unidirectional meters were not designed for feeding power back into the grid, and you're not supposed to do it. So then they came up with a solution, which are the bidirectional or smart meters. So bidirectional meters are able to measure what you pulled out of the grid, and then there's a separate counter, a separate value that exactly knows how much you pushed back into the grid. That's a bidirectional meter. Bidirectional meter is designed for allowing bidirectional traffic of energy, of electricity. And then you have different models. You have the smart meters that are able to monitor remotely what your energy consumption is, and some of them can even connect or disconnect your connection with the grid. And then there's a term which you probably have heard before, which is the feed-in tariff. So feed-in tariff is a relatively old term that refers to the time at which there wasn't too much solar and wind power available yet, and people like yourself would be stimulated, they would be encouraged to produce solar or wind power at their residences. So this was a great system because you would receive money for any energy produced locally. It didn't even matter whether you're using yourself or feeding it back into the grid, you would always receive a bonus for each unit of electricity that you would produce locally. So that was one of the earlier structures, the feed-in tariff. Some people still have it because, you would close a deal for a very long term, but most of the times you cannot get these deals anymore. Another term which I might have come across is that of net metering, which is a relatively simple structure whereby they measure the amount of power that you're taking from the grid, the amount of power that you're feeding back into the grid, and then by the end of the term, by the end of the month or the year, they just see what the balance is, and they deduct whatever you feed back into the grid from what you have consumed, and that's the bill that you're getting. So normally, for net metering, you're getting just as much for what you're feeding into the grid as what you're getting out of the grid. So this is net metering, and net metering is a pretty interesting financial model as well. All right, let him shut up for a second. I just want to explain to you that the content of this video is copied from the complete course of energy systems. If this information is enough for you, great. If you want to learn more and if you want to get access to the complete course, then check the information in the description below. All right, you go ahead again. Nowadays, depending on where you are on the world, this might not be available at your location anymore, because what they've often replaced net metering with is with this some kind of a successor tariff. So this is a bit of a general term, and it really depends on where you are exactly what the new financial compensation models are. Most of the times you're getting less for the power that you're feeding back into the grid with the successor tariffs compared to with net metering. So let's look at what the meters are actually measuring. So they're definitely looking at both the quantity and the quality of the power that's flowing in or out of the grid. So they're looking at how much is flowing, and they're looking at the quality. And for your information, it's quite interesting because most of the time the power that you're providing back into the grid is of a higher quality, of higher standards compared to that what is coming out of the grid. But most of the times you're not being compensated for providing really high quality, but they are measuring it, right? And then the second time, and that is relatively important and is becoming more and more important now, is the time of use. So when are you pulling power out of the grid, and when are you feeding it back into the grid? So the time of use for when you're using it, that is something that has been around for a long time, right? During the day, you normally pay more for your electricity than during the night. But now it's also looking more and more at which point you're feeding power back into the grid. Because with your solar power, if you're producing power in the late afternoon, when it's normally peak rate, so a higher rate for electricity, then it would be great if you are also getting a higher rate for electricity that you're feeding back into the grid. So I want to look with you specifically on all these different compensation models. And I want to explain with you what the pros and the cons are of the different models and how they work. So let's go to the whiteboard and let's draw a blueprint of a grid-tied solar energy system. So we have you, your house, your residence with all your loads in there. We have the grid and you are connected to the grid via a meter. Then we have your solar array, which is normally connected straight to your house. And I will be using 3 different colors. So I've got the blue for the solar power, the red for the grid power, the power coming from the grid, and the black will indicate a line which is active, which is live, but which is not necessarily conducting any electricity. So a live line which is not necessarily being used. So it would be ideal that during a power outage, during a power cut, if there would be no power available from the grid, that if you would have all these solar panels installed, that you can actually consume your power. But unfortunately, this is normally not possible because there are safety features built into the control equipment, the hardware between your panels and your house, that will not allow the panels to produce any electricity if there's no live connection to the grid. So if the grid is down and there's no power, you're not able to pull power from the grid or feed it back into the grid, then your panels will also not work if you only have panels and no batteries. So what you must have is always a live connection to the grid. Doesn't matter if you're using power, but it must be there. There must be a live connection in order to make your solar panels produce energy and work for you. Now, the way in which this is normally wired is that your solar power can flow both through your house or through your bidirectional meter back into the grid. So you need to have this active connection to the grid, so a live connection that you don't really need to use, but it needs to be there in order to make your solar panels work, and then you can produce enough power to consume it all yourself, and if you have an excess, it flows back to the grid. So, but you need, for this situation, normally you need a bidirectional meter or a smart meter. So a smart meter is just an advanced bidirectional meter. So let's take a small sidestep, and I want to look at the